Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's time for us to open the 2024 Aspen Security Forum. You're all most welcome. And please now join me for our opening remarks today come from our co-founder of the Aspen Strategy Group and the co-chair of Aspen Security Forum and Aspen Strategy Group, Professor Joe Nye.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you to the 15th Aspen Security Forum. The idea of having a place where we can get together away from Washington and national capitals and try to think about the world's problems is very important. And as in traditional Aspen manner, it's purely nonpartisan. So in that sense, we're lucky to have the speakers and the moderators and all you as our attendees and participants, as well as people around the world who are watching this online. I'd like to also thank the president and CEO of Aspen, Dan Porterfield, who is here, and the board chair, Margot Pritzker, and Elliot Gerson, who is a long stalwart. And I should note for those of you who are old Aspen hands that we're graced by the presence of Walter Isaacson. Now, it says in the notes that were handed to me when I got off the plane this afternoon, now you're on your own. You're supposed to do a scene setter for the forum. Well, it reminded me of that famous description of the French Revolution, the best of times and the worst of times. And today is not the worst of times. If you look back in our history, despite the bad things we see around us today, it has been worse. I'm going to talk about this in my book talk tomorrow afternoon, so I won't bother with it now. But if one thinks back, or as one lived through the 1960s, where we suffered from 3 major assassinations and cities on fire, this is not the worst of times, despite the horrible return of violence and assassination that we saw this last week. But it's not the best of times either. Think back to an Aspen Security Forum 3 or 4 years ago, and somebody asked, well, what's going on in the world? And you would have said, well, there are all sorts of problems, difficult problems, but basically the last thing we would expect is a great war in Europe. People would have said, yes, Putin might nibble away at more of Donetsk, but he's not likely to try to seize the whole thing. And now what we have is 2.5 years of a bloody war, which hundreds of thousands of people have died. So that's one of the things that's not as good as it was a few years ago. Or think of the Middle East. If we think back to a security forum a few years ago, we would have said, finally, after decades, it looks like there's progress. We have the Abraham Accords. It looks like you're going to have some rapprochement between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The word was that the Saudis would find some way to relate to the Israelis if the Israelis made progress on a Palestinian issue. And then, of course, there was last October 7th, where we had the atrocities of the hostage taking and the killing that launched what is now not 2.5 years of war. We hope it won't be, but has been getting on now toward a year of war. And this is not even to mention areas of the world like Sudan, where we're facing another possible genocidal situation. So not the worst of times, but certainly not the best of times. In that sense, I think we have to look and ask ourselves, what is technology bringing us? And the technology that everyone is thinking about today is obviously artificial intelligence. And we're going to hear about it here at the Security Forum and more later. But the questions of artificial intelligence are questions which can also be best and worst. If you think of the prospects in medicine of understanding protein folding and curing cancer, enormous progress is possible. On the other hand, if you think about autonomous lethal weapons and terrorists getting their hands on them, it could be the worst. So we're faced with major technological changes, and we don't know whether they'll bring best or worst of times. So in that sense, I want to say that going back to where I mentioned a few minutes ago, the fact that we have a nonpartisan opportunity for discussioning of these issues is extremely important. We have been disrupted in our program by events. The horrible assassination attempt means that we're missing our people from Homeland Security and the Secret Service, who were supposed to be with us. And our speaker, who is to kick this off this afternoon, the former director of the Aspen Strategy Group, Nick Burns, now ambassador to China, is stuck in China with COVID. We haven't escaped that yet either in terms of best and worst of times. However, we have been able to deal with the major challenge of China with a spectacular panel, which Neve is going to introduce for you. And it's 4 excellent people dealing with the China challenge. And I will report to Nick that it took 4 people to replace him. So welcome again to Aspen Strategy Forum, and we hope you'll have a fruitful and enlightening next several days.
Thanks, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, he is a national and global treasure, so he is. My next job is to thank everybody who makes this all possible. We have many of our sponsors here, and if you could please hold your applause, but we're so deeply grateful to them for their support and their partnership, because none of this would be possible without them, so you should all be grateful too. Google, and we have the beautiful Google Pavilion out there, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, McKinsey, Microsoft, MITRE, the Walton Family Foundation, AWS, the Financial Times, Lockheed Martin, Rockefeller Foundation, Govini, Intel, American Airlines, Anduril, Beacon Global Strategies, Boeing, Gecko, Prion, Citi, Mayer Brown, and Zscaler. So thank you very much. Well, Joe set the scene, and now I'm going to please invite our panelists to come to the stage so we can start the China Challenge, the opening panel of the 15th Annual Aspen Security Forum. Thank you. First on stage is our moderator, Dimitri Sevastopoulos, who is the U.S.-China correspondent for the Financial Times. We have Steve Began, who is the former Deputy Secretary of State. Alan Estevez, who's the Undersecretary for Industry and Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And my boss, Anne Emanuel, who's the Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. And over to you, Dimitri.
Thank you very much, Niamh. And I don't know how you used your Irish magic powers to stop the rain, but thank you very much. And if anyone has any problems understanding my Irish accent, Niamh will provide simultaneous interpretation. We're going to have a Q&A at the end for about 10 minutes, so please think of some questions and put your hand up at the end and identify yourself before you ask your question. But we're going to jump in. Eric, I'm going to start with you. In 2021, you were the chair of the the National Security Commission on AI. You published a massive report. I remember it was about 2 inches thick. Someone very kindly delivered it to my home. And it said that China was a US peer for many AI applications, and it was a leader for some applications. So my question is, how does the situation look today? What do you think have been the biggest developments in AI in both the US and China?
Had we issued that report today, you, being a busy person, would have simply fed it into ChatGPT to summarize it. 758 pages. This is progress. So we've all been working on the China problem for a long time. And I think the big news is that the Trump decision, followed by Biden's affirmation of that decision to limit access to specific chips, was the right decision. We had recommended it in the report we did, but they actually took action, and they took action very quickly and dispositively. There have been a series of adjustments, but roughly, here's where we are. 2 years ago, there was a very important chip made by NVIDIA called an A100. Today, the closest that China can get to A100 performance is the ones that they had, the ones they've stolen, and then clones which are not as good. This is a profoundly important problem for them. It's driving them absolutely bonkers. Today, one way to understand the performance difference is we collectively are at 2 to 3 times the performance. Now, why does chip performance matter? It matters a lot because these systems are these huge supercomputers, and the gains that occur unpredictably as you increase in scale. And so they can't get to the level we are without an enormous amount of capital, and it's very difficult, or they can steal it or copy it in some complicated way. With the Blackwell chip, and we're using NVIDIA as the example, which comes out in volume next year, that gap will be a factor of 5. And then the factor will be another factor, because another doubling, it'll be a factor of 10. That is a huge policy issue. Consistent, and I'll just summarize the rest, there's a lot more to say. In addition to that fact, which is incredibly important, you have other things going on. There's been an enormous reduction in foreign direct investment, in particular venture capital. The valuations, which have historically in China been higher than in the US, are now significantly lower than the US, and they're not going up. Furthermore, there are only 2 companies, this is Alibaba and ByteDance, that are doing any significant foundation model, which are the big models.
That's Xi Jinping.
No, that was actually the government saying, you said the word ByteDance and we banned them. Okay. So anyway, so just to finish up, you have the ByteDance and Alibaba are doing significant foundation model training. Even the other big ones are not. The startups are struggling. And so for all of the doom and gloom that I had said 2 years ago, because I was very concerned that the software architectures in China would catch up, I think a reasonable conclusion, is very important, is that there will not be another global standard platform. There will be a unified platform like ByteDance and TikTok in the future. That in fact, China will build stuff for its ecosystem and the rest will. And that is a very big deal for them because we're bigger in aggregate than they are, and scale matters. So overall, we're in much better shape than I expected. This is not true in all the other technological areas. We're all familiar with electronic vehicle issues and batteries and things like that, where China's done a fantastic job. There's all sorts of issues in there, but in AI, we're doing well.
Someone's growing.
Someone is really unhappy about ByteDance.
But if the Chinese Communist Party can control the weather, then we have bigger problems than AI. But anyway, Alan, I'm going to jump from what Eric said to you. You are one of the most important people in the government who is promoting what Jake Sullivan calls a small yard, high fence strategy. Could you explain very briefly to people, to lay people, what that is? Where do you think it's working, and where are the kind of key challenges as you look down the road now?
So thank you. On? Yep. Thanks, Dimitri. And thank you, Eric, for noting our chip controls.
Good job.
And more to be done there.
We need to say more thank yous to the government.
He's got the scars to show it.
Yeah, that's true. It's a tough job, Anya. Well, you know, it's not just the chip controls that we put on. So small yards, when we're controlling just a few handful of high-end chips that are really good for training large language artificial intelligence models. So the vast majority of chips that are made in the world are made by US companies or Korean companies, Japanese companies, are free to flow to China without any kind of licensing. But a select few at a certain level of capability, we've put controls on. And not only did we control those chips, we control the manufacturing equipment that can make those chips, which is incredibly important as well. Because given the right equipment, China could produce their own chips. I mean, they have the capability, they have the capacity, they have the engineers. You know, they don't have hundreds of years, or I shouldn't say hundreds. They don't have the long time of expertise of, say, TSMC, but they're willing to hire people from TSMC in order to do that. So controlling the manufacturing equipment is incredibly important. And again, it's not all manufacturing equipment, it's just a certain level of manufacturing equipment that we're controlling. Now, so that's the small yard, high fence thing. Now, with that, all that said, we can't rest on our laurels. I always say, I'm in Aspen, so I probably have broken my paranoid bubble, but in Washington, I live in a paranoid bubble. And I'm paid to live in that paranoid bubble, thinking about what's going to go on next. So we're always looking. Huawei can make a decent chip. It's not quite as good as an A100, but it's a decent AI chip called an Aspen 910B. They're doing that through brute force. It's not the best method and process for making those chips, but they're working on those processes. So we're always looking, well, if they're doing that, what should we be doing that also needs to be protected in that small yard high fence? Let me stop there.
I'm just going to go kind of link two things that you said and Eric said. If you look to last year when Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, your boss, was in China, Huawei took the opportunity to roll out a very advanced smartphone using a very advanced chip. My question is, was that China surprising the US and actually managing to get around the export controls? Or when you put the export controls in place, did you think that Huawei would be able to do something like that?
So again, the controls are not a dammed up river. We need to keep producing and innovating on our end of this. The chip that's in that Huawei phone, which is not that concerning to me as opposed to the AI chips that they're capable of making, is not as good as the chip that was in the Huawei phone in 2019. I'll take that as a success. Nonetheless, again, as I said, they have capability, they have capacity, they're willing to throw a lot of money at it, they're willing to do things that are not economically viable if you're trying to run a real business, but that the state is subsidizing, and they're taking advantage of that, and they're going to keep advancing, and we need to keep advancing ahead of that.
Eric, you wanted to jump in?
Just to compliment you further, the genius of your strategy is that you found a monopoly that exists in one company in the world that we had control over, which is ASML. And that decision allowed you to then put the regime in place. It's important to state, and you know this because you've covered it so long, the entanglement of China and the US is profound. And in fact, everyone complains about China, but our trade with China is going up. And everything we do to try to prevent things, China can nullify. In other words, if you think about the sanctions on Russia over Ukraine, China just Instead of having iPhones in Russia, they have Chinese phones, which are quite good. The key is to find control points that the Chinese cannot replicate. And unfortunately, software is not one of them, and common chips is another one that doesn't work. That's the secret and the brilliance of what they did.
So, Anya and Steve, in a minute, I want to zoom out from tech and look more broadly at business concerns and how American and multilateral companies are dealing with China. But can you both just address first, how do you think companies are dealing with the US-China tech competition when the US is taking measures, as Alan described, but China is also doing things as well? So how are companies in general looking at this problem?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And let me just take a little bit of a step back for this highly educated audience here. Let's keep sight of the goal. The country that leads in technology tends to lead the world. Roman roads, Chinese gunpowder, British steamships, and so on and so forth. The United States and our friends and allies have been the undisputed technology leaders for decades. And now we have someone who's running the race and running really fast, and that's China. So the goal here should be for the US and our friends and allies to run faster in this race. There's two ways to win a race. One, you hobble the other guy, and Alan and team are working on that. There's another way to do it, which is to run faster ourselves. And this gets to what our companies are doing, and I think this is what your question is getting to, Dimitri. We need to remain the fastest and best innovation country in the world. That used to be undisputed, but there's more that we can do to help. And I'll give you an example. There was an amazing show of bipartisanship a couple of years ago when the US Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act. Alan, Gina Raimondo team worked really hard on that. The CHIPS part, which is to get some semiconductor manufacturing here, is fully funded, it's moving ahead, they're doing a great job. The science piece, the US Congress authorized $175 billion for basic science R&D. But they haven't actually appropriated much of the funds. So we're way lower. Last year, we gave the National Science Foundation and their partners something like $19 billion. China is doing $50 billion of R&D. So I just want us to keep sight of the other piece of it too, which is running faster.
Steve?
Yeah, so I want to give some credit to the tech industry itself, because I think it's, after a slightly sluggish start, and what was asked of the tech industry was to fundamentally redesign their businesses. They've actually done a pretty good job, and I have the full confidence the tech industry is going to abide by the laws, and the policies are going to interact with people like Alan in order to shape those policies. But at the end of the day, they're going to follow those policies. They're also responding by relocating their production and their supply chains. They're taking the necessary steps to succeed in their businesses and to diversify the footprint of their businesses against various risks. At the same time, they're also going to be watching for the risk of retaliation in China. And China has begun to take steps to put pressure on those companies, export controls, limits on market. And frankly, that's not new. For nearly a decade now, China has been systematically beginning to extract American technology from the Chinese economy. But nonetheless, many of these companies whose products will be inside that small yard will have other parts of their business that need the scale in the Russian market, and so they'll be watching for the risk of retaliation. Those companies will be looking to compete in the world. And the competition, in part, means for them, particularly those parts of their businesses that are outside that small yard, there's going to need to be international cooperation on some of these policies, because it's not going to help American companies if European or Japanese or Korean companies are moving in to fill the markets as the United States tech industry is excluded. They're also going to be looking to grow, and so developing and delivering scale for the tech industry in other places through initiatives with our trading partners in Asia and in Europe is incredibly important. And none of this is going to be easy. Just a couple of years ago, Anya and I participated in a discussion in Europe with European technology leaders, and we were discussing how do we get that scale in the transatlantic market between the United States and Europe so that we can be independent, have a strong business foundation. And the reaction was, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't want American companies coming in and conquesting European technology markets. So we have to think long and hard about how we create a model and example to deliver that scale for our companies in the markets around the world.
Anya, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add one point, and Steve made me think of it. You write all these amazing articles about decoupling, de-risking. You should really all read Dimitri's stuff. It's fantastic. It educates all of us. What is often left out is how much the Chinese are doing to back off from international cooperation. So it's always phased as, oh, the US is doing this. But there is a directive called Directive 79, otherwise affectionately known as Delete America, where Chinese state-owned enterprises, governments, and some of the biggest companies are being asked to take US, especially hardware, out of their systems. Now they're moving to US software. And some of our tech companies are losing huge market share. So this separation is real. And I think no matter who's in the White House come January, that's only going to get more extreme.
So good. Alan, 2 follow-ups for you based on something that Anya and Steve both said. Given that you're a current sitting government employee, you're going to suffer a little bit more. You have been to Japan and the Netherlands a lot. They make chip-making tools. They're very important to kind of to complement the export controls that the US has implemented. What do you want Japan and the Netherlands to do that they haven't done so far?
Well, first, thanks for that, Dimitri. And I also want to compliment you on your reporting. You're always fair in my space, which is not always true across the...
There's going to be a lot of free drinks tonight, I feel. But
I'm in on that.
That's how we roll.
Look, it's not just Japan and the Netherlands. I want to say it's allied nations that have interests in the semiconductor ecosystem. You know, certain of those countries make certain tools. Eric called out ASML a little while ago. So, you know, we go to places where there's choke points, but there's others and there's key components of those tools that are made in other nations. So we're talking to lots of countries about here's the risk from China controlling an artificial intelligence capability inside their military complex. That should frighten people and should frighten our allies, and it does frighten our allies. Now, Steve's point, they are concerned about retaliation by China. And they believe that we can absorb more retaliation than some of those countries can. And they're probably right about that, given the nature of their economies. So we're cognizant of that, and we're working with them, to make it a more broad-brushed control in a multilateral sense. But at the same time, making sure that we are actually controlling the things that can impede China's ability to design, produce high-end artificial intelligence chips.
So the second thing I wanted to ask you was, you know, Anya said one of the keys is for the US to run faster. And I think it was also last year on this stage, maybe Pat Gelsinger from Intel and some others, there's an argument in Washington among some people in the business community that if you push the export controls too hard, that the small yard is too big and the fence is too high, that it restricts the abilities of those companies to make easy money in China that they can then funnel back to the US to do more cutting-edge research. Do you give any credence to that argument, or have you dismissed it out of hand completely?
Couple of things there. And, you know, to Anya's point, we do have to play offense and defense. That's the way we talk about it inside the Department of Commerce. I'm like a middle linebacker. People running the CHIPS office are quarterbacks and running backs and the like. Or Alan Davidson, who's in the audience, is, you know, doing broadband for all. That's offense, building capacity in the United States. But yeah, so we are definitely impacting revenue. On the other hand, as you said, China is working to de-Americanize their products, in some part because of what we're doing, but in some part because they want to build their own capacity. And from a national security perspective, I have to take that into account as a stronger point, that we're protecting the long game here, not the short game. And frankly, a lot of the companies that I'm impacting are still doing quite well in China.
Eric.
Can I answer on Alan's behalf, since I'm such a fan, by simply, and he can't say this, the thesis of your question is false. NVIDIA last week was the most valuable company in the entire world. QED.
I think you're talking about the equipment manufacturers, though.
Yes, and this is true, but China's trying to build its own equipment manufacturing system, which is also hobbling them. And furthermore, the equipment that's important that Alan restricted is the thing that's hard to build, right?
So let's move away from tech for a little bit and look at, you're definitely getting free drinks. I might
The Commerce Department is going to hire Eric Schmidt.
There's a reason why you left Washington for the day.
Best day I've had in a while.
So let's zoom out a little bit, and we can talk about tech again later, but look at kind of broader US-China kind of business relations. Anya, you talked about de-risking. Do you think, I mean, are we de-risking as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, the term that she coined? Or do you think we are moving towards more of a kind of a broader decoupling in a nascent way? Where do you see things more broadly across a range of industries, not just tech?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. You know, we've been really solidly focused on technology, but if you look at the US-China commercial relationship, it's actually pretty robust, and I think that's a really important positive, and we should keep it that way. So, look, on the negative side, at the high point, I think foreign direct investment in China was 300 plus billion. Last year, they eked out 33 billion net positive. So a lot of this has to do with the Chinese economy not doing as well as it did before. Much less US investment in the Chinese economy. However, that hides some really big and important differences. And let me just run through the range. If you start with agriculture, there's 1.4 billion people in China. They want safe, healthy food. They cannot produce enough on their own because they're drought prone, not enough arable land. They import a lot from the United States. I think something like $33 billion last year. That's a really good thing. We should keep that going. Moving along, consumer products. There is no national security concern here. I have no concerns at all with Starbucks, with McDonald's, with Nike, with many of our brands doing well there, and a lot of them are doing well and quietly expanding. Then if you keep going, the entertainment companies had a hard time because there was so much censorship. Now there's a little bit less in China, but that's soft power. Joe and I invented the term. It's important. We need to have cultural connections. Then you move to financial services. The Chinese were really rolling out the red carpet for our big banks and our private equity firms. I think that's a little bit harder, and I think a lot of them have pulled back. You see their exposure to China dropping, I think something like 25%. And then you get all the way to what we've been talking about, which is technology, where I think the de-risking, decoupling is going to become more and more complete.
Steve, do you want to add anything?
The companies have a hard time with de-risking because risk is by far the most corrosive factor in a business plan because you can't control for it. You can control for higher commodity prices and you can price for it in your product. You can control for higher labor prices and likewise price in your project, overcapacity, you can cut, you can do layoffs, you can cut production. There's ways to deal with a lot of things that challenge the business, but risk and undefined risk is incredibly challenging. And so companies will, I think, tend to go right from de-risking to decoupling because they can't find that sweet spot, that middle ground to kind of expose their business to risk, but not entirely. It's just not possible to capture risk with that kind of approach. There are things that help. Having clarity in the rules. Alan knows this. I'm sure he's heard it from many companies. And quite honestly, I've heard it from the Chinese as well. The Chinese have told me that in principle, they're not opposed to the national security controls. They understand them, and they would be hypocritical for them to challenge them anyway because they do the same thing. But their concern is that there'll be a creeping yard growing or a increasingly high fence. And they kind of want to know where the lines are. Well, that's what the business community is going to ask for too. That certainty and clarity so they can plan around their business. And then that's how they'll de-risk.
So, sorry, Eric, you want to...
I have actually a question for Anya. So if I listen to your list, is correct, can you divide them into the following? Strategic industries and everything else. So let's imagine that if I listen to your list, you basically said technology was strategic and the other stuff is like fine. is there any scenario we could get an agreement as to what's strategic? I'm worried that if we promote this idea, then everyone will be strategic and so forth. In other words, as a governance and strategy perspective, does that make any sense based on your understanding of how that works?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And from the US government perspective, I think you're trying really hard to define very carefully, we keep speaking for Alan, sorry, but to parse very carefully what is strategic and what impacts our national security and what doesn't, and what should just be left alone. And I think it's actually not even all of technology. You know this, you ran the biggest technology company out there, but there are bits and pieces. In my view, is we should continue to have people-to-people exchanges with China. We should continue trading with China. It is important for there to be the connectivity between these two countries below the Chinese Communist Party, because you need to have someone who's pushing back against their propaganda. And so the more narrowly we can define what's strategic, which I think is what you're arguing for, I think the better.
And let me just jump in there because...
You're doing
Feel free to make use, Alan, by the way.
Yeah, it is a variation of technology. So I'm sitting next to a Boeing executive. We want Boeing to be able to sell 737 MAXs in China.
Absolutely.
I don't want you to sell MQ-25s in China. That's pretty obvious.
Don't worry.
Yeah, that's pretty obviously. You know, and I want people to be able to sell avionics parts that are good for commercial airplanes in China, not good for military jets. Right? So there's gradations in that. You know, the list that you rattled off was a list that my boss, Gina Raimondo, could easily rattle off as well. You know, our shorthand version of this is promote what we can, protect what we must. And what we must is that small yard of the highest end of the tech, not all tech.
So let's leave business aside for a second. Apologies to anyone in the business world. Steve and Anya, you've been involved in track 2 conversations with Chinese officials. We're 8 months in San Francisco when Joe Biden met Xi Jinping. Where do you think the US-China relationship is broadly now compared to this time last year? Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, I would say right now it's a bit dormant. The Chinese are being very careful at this moment, considering that the great experiment of democracy is playing out in the republic. That they're trying not. I think they have the maturity to know that if they place a bet, they might get it wrong, and the consequences will be severe. And so the Chinese are sitting back and watching, guarding their vital interests. But I think there is reason for a bit of concern about the China debate here in the United States. Eric asked the right question: is how do we separate out the urgent from the important, from the not so important? And right now we're in a debate on China policy that's really pushing to a high denominator across the board, and I think there's risks inside that as well. The Europeans have a bumper sticker to cooperate with regarding their China policy: cooperate where possible, compete where necessary, oppose where required. And I think that's a good slogan for Europe. It's not going to work for us. And my view is a good policy for us is to deter, to compete, and to engage. And all three of them have to be part of our policy. We have to be engaged with the Chinese. There are attendant risks in the notion of decoupling, because decoupling removes interdependence. Interdependence changes the cost-benefit calculations of countries that are seeking to act with aggression. There are healthy impulses that come from the interdependence, and I believe there's policymakers on both sides, on China's side and the US side, who believe that completely decoupling from the economy will give us more freedom of maneuver. But I think they're underestimating the degree to which that decoupling also may create scenarios that we don't want to see.
Anya, what about in terms of geopolitics and some of the places in Asia where we have hotspots right now? Do you think we're in a better place than we were a year ago or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're going to have Dr. Ang, Singapore's defense minister, up here in a minute to tell us all about that. Just to use Steve's framework, which I think is a good one, I think the Biden administration has done a pretty good job on all three of the facets you chose. I think no one is under any illusions that you're going to have a positive upward swing in the relationship with China. What the Woodside Summit in November in California did was put a floor under relations, and it did 3 really important things. We now have military-to-military dialogues. Those were dead in the water. That is extraordinarily dangerous when you have Chinese Coast Guard and shipping vessels around the Philippines, in outlying islands of Taiwan, South and East China Sea. It's really complicated. You want our militaries to talk to each other. And by the way, even during the height of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union always had those talks. So that may sound really esoteric, but it's really, really important that we have them. We also started an AI dialogue. We also started a fentanyl dialogue. I think those aren't progressing as well. We've got a lot of folks coming from the White House that can tell you more about that later in this conference. But overall, we have a steady state. The most important thing I think that this administration has done is really work to shore up our alliances in Asia. If you look at bringing Japan and South Korea together in ways that wouldn't have been possible maybe 5 or 6 years ago. How close we are to the Philippines, how much work is happening in South and Southeast Asia. I think those are all positive steps.
Can I come back to the engagement part, though? Because I think there's more to it. It is commerce. We should be engaged commercially with the Chinese. It's the largest market in the world for many products, and it's an important part of the global supply chain. Doing business with China should not be treated as bad, and I think it delivers a lot of benefits to the United States of America. But engagement in Track 2 dialogues, Dimitri mentioned, at some point in 2023, a switch went on in Beijing, and there are dozens of Chinese experts, former military officials, former diplomats, who are engaging with their counterparts as former officials, academics, experts in the United States. That's happening right now, and that's a very good thing. It's a way to deliver signals and messages between the two societies that wouldn't happen if we disengage. And those signals, even at an unofficial level, are very important to shaping the decisions of policymakers. But also we should be more engaged in a people-to-people sense, particularly to build our own capacity to understand China. Today, there are 300,000 plus Chinese students studying at universities across the United States of America. 15,000 Americans are studying in China today. The offset is incredible, and it should be alarming. We need Americans, we need young Americans who understand China, who have relationships with Chinese people in order to deliver the outcomes that we want.
Is there a danger that with all of the anti-China rhetoric in Washington, whether you buy into it or not, that young Americans look at their career in the future and they think going to China to study Chinese is not a smart move?
American students are not going to study in China because they have the misimpression that they will not get security clearances to work in the United States government.
I have 3 who studied in China working directly for me because they're awesome.
It's a misimpression, but that is the vibe that they're picking up. And Ambassador Nick Burns, were he here, would tell you about this because he speaks strongly about the urgency that we have to get more of our students there.
So the US government should be doing more to explain to people that it won't impact security clearances in the future.
I don't know, in the political zeitgeist of the moment, Dimitri, I don't know if it's possible because that's not where the debate is here.
So I'm going to ask a leading question. I would think last year we were talking a hell of a lot about Taiwan. I was recently at the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Forum in Singapore, where the Chinese defense minister wanted to talk only about Taiwan, and everyone in the audience wanted to talk only about the Philippines, and the second Thomas Shoal, where the Chinese are being very aggressive in trying to stop the Philippines resupplying some Marines who are stationed on a World War II era ship that's marooned on this tiny reef. It sounds like Mickey Mouse, but it actually could be the first time the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty or any bilateral mutual defense treaty is triggered. So my question is, how worried should we be about the second Thomas Shoal? Is it getting enough attention? And Anya, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Should the US be escorting Philippine supply vessels to give them more protection?
I think it's getting an appropriate amount of attention. In fact, it's pretty dangerous. You've seen CQ Brown, who's going to be here later. He's been trying to tamp down the temperature there. You see the Filipinos tamping down the temperature because I think this is a conflict that no one wants to precipitate. It just doesn't end well because even though we have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, when you read the language, it's a little bit complicated. Do marooned, wrecked ships on the second Thomas Shoal count? Do they not? So I think it's in everyone's interest to calm this situation down, and I think we're gradually doing that.
So speaking of calming things down, and then we'll go to questions, who would like to volunteer a view on how you think a second Trump presidency versus a second Biden term would be on China policy?
Not me.
So all I'll say is that Trump has announced in his campaign rhetoric that there will be a 40% tariff on Chinese goods.
60%.
It's gone up. And a global tariff of 10%, is that right? 20. It's gone up too. It's gone up in the last few weeks. This would ultimately result in higher costs for those of you who shop at Walmart and those of you who shop at everywhere else.
I can maybe add a point because I'm out of both of those administrations. If there's a second Biden administration, I think you have a lot of continuity. They've talked about managed competition. They're handling it the way they're handling it, and I think you're going to see steady as she goes. The Trump administration, if there is one, is nothing if not unpredictable. So you've seen completely opposite things coming. Some people who used to work for Donald Trump, like Pottinger, and others are very Reaganite. There's a Foreign Affairs article that was written recently saying we must win this war, we can't just manage competition. You know, it's sort of Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And then you have Trump saying things like 60% tariffs. That's probably not good for his base. You have Trump, on the other hand, saying, well, Taiwan, they stole business and the semiconductor business from America. Why should we protect them? So that, if I were the Chinese, would lead me to believe that I wouldn't be as strong on the protection of Taiwan, or because he's so unpredictable that he might do something even more rash. So I don't know if that's a positive or a negative, but boy, it's going to be a wild ride.
This is the number one question you get asked when you visit China by Chinese counterparts. And I always throw back to them, well, who do you want to win? And it would surprise you how often the answer is President Trump, because there is a certain fascination about him in China and a sense of that unpredictability can also deliver outcomes that the Chinese want. President Trump was not afraid to engage with the Chinese, and he did so. They obviously worked very hard to shape his policies, but I think you could expect that again. My concern, Dimitri, is actually beyond the borders of China, is that any effective policy we have is going to require standing on the foundation of partners, friends, and allies around the world. And the 20% across-the-board tariff for all trading partners in the United States of America is going to make it very difficult for us to turn around and enlist those same countries in a set of sensible policies on a coordinated basis that address our national security concerns. So my biggest concern is actually outside the borders of China.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions from the floor. Let's see. Gentleman here in the middle. And
Thank
if you
you.
can just say your name, and please keep the questions short because we only have 6 or 7 minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sean Sebastian. My question is about a fast commodifying technology, electric vehicles, pardon me. While Tesla gets all the headlines here, BYD in China makes twice as many cars as Tesla does. And those cars are generating 1 terabyte a day of data that is micro-mapping. That feels like a real threat to have China gathering that information about our practices here. I'd like to comment on how we think about that on a go-forward basis.
So, Alan, the Biden administration launched an investigation into connected vehicles. Do you want to talk about that?
Yep. So we did put out, in Washington, it would be called an advance notice of rulemaking. We will come out with a notice of that rule in about a month, sometime in August. And what we're looking at is the point you're making. A car is a very scary thing. Your car knows a lot about you. Your car probably gets a software update, whether it's an electric vehicle or an internal combustion engine vehicle. A modern car has lots of software in it. It's taking lots of pictures. It has a drive system. It's connected to your phone. It knows who you call. It knows where you go. It knows a lot about you. And it's able to, because it's taken a software update in, it also can, of course, send data out. That software update in can also say, yeah, on this day, that car doesn't start. So we're looking at a few components and some software, not the whole car, but it would be some of the key driver components of the vehicle that manage the software and manage the data around that car that would have to be made in an allied country.
If you want to scare yourself, read the fine print on the mandatory disclosures in your automobile on the types of data that are collected on you. If you don't want to read your user manual, which nobody does, just Google it. You'll see it there. And it's an extraordinary amount of personal data that is traveling around with you in that vehicle.
Or just ask your car, it'll probably tell you.
At the very back at the left, my left.
Hello, it's Guy Taylor from Threat Status. I have two quick questions. First of all,
we keep it to one just to be fair to other people?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry. I'm sorry? What do I need to do?
Can you keep it to one question,
One.
not two? Thank you.
It's going to be hard. I guess I'll go with Alan then. I had one for Steve. But my question for Alan is, do you think that BIS could be more effective if it were recreated into a U.S. intelligence agency, essentially?
Despite rumors, BIS has a strong intel component, with lots of people with clearances, with a direct linkage to the IC that I utilize every day. Whether commerce itself should be part of the IC, there's lots of puts and takes on that. But we have a very strong link to the IC and to law enforcement in general, to tell you the truth.
Do you have enough money to do what you need to do?
I could probably use a $75 million a year above my flat budget since 2010, and another $100 million to upgrade my IT system that you can't Google and say, what license did I put out in whatever year to whatever company.
Let's see. Lady just in front of me here.
Thank you so much, Nicole Muchnick from Los Angeles. I wonder if you can comment on the Belt and Road Initiative and if there have been any surprises.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one, and Steve may want to chime in too. So the Belt and Road Initiative exploded onto the scene. It was building railroads, asphalt, ports, sometimes dual-use ports, but most importantly, I think, was the digital Silk Road, where the Chinese government has given surveillance technology to a lot of its authoritarian friends around the world. That is the part of it that scares me the most. You know, a few years ago, when you had headline after headline about the Belt and Road, I would travel to Africa and Latin America and think, oh, most of the people I see here are already frustrated that they're bringing in only Chinese workers, that there's so much corruption, that the labor standards are low, that the environmental standards are low. So a part of that had within it the seeds of its own destruction. And by the way, as China's economy is slowing, Chinese people are saying, well, why are we building ports over there? We need our money here. But the digital Silk Road is really powerful. And you know, this gets back to what Eric said in the beginning about AI and how good the Chinese are at AI. Visual recognition, artificial intelligence, they're expert at.
So I have a longer-term view of Belt and Road. Obviously, any place where it's building military-capable infrastructure in geographically or geopolitically sensitive areas is worrisome to us, and Anya mentioned some of the technologies. But also there's a deficit in global infrastructure development around the world, and if the Chinese want to help developing countries improve their infrastructure, we should be careful in how quickly we judge against that. Also, the debt trap diplomacy and the loans that oftentimes finance this and put emerging markets and developing countries into impossible debt situations is very familiar to me as a former U.S. foreign policy maker. Through the course of the 1960s and 1970s and into the 1980s, we loaned hundreds of billions of dollars to impoverished countries around the world that had no possibility of ever repaying it. And finally, in the year 2000, in what was called the Jubilee, under the leadership outside of government by Bono, the United States government just straight line forgave over $100 billion in debt because the countries that had this debt couldn't even afford to service the interest on the debt, much less ever have a chance to pay them off. And so they were locked into a cycle of poverty in constant debt. The Chinese are heading down this road. And by the way, a lot of those countries really stopped liking us when we were calling our loans with them. So there's real foreign policy implications to having countries dependent. If you think you're going to go in and repossess a port or seize some sovereign asset inside that country and still be able to maintain a relationship, so there will be costs to doing this wrong. And we learned a lot of tough lessons ourselves in the late stages of the Cold War.
Well, I think given that you've just praised one of my Irish compatriots, that's a perfect place to end. So I would like to thank the panelists, and please give them a huge round of applause. Thank you.
Jenny will lead you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know we've given you a lot to talk about, but we have one more very important session here that I think you're all going to want to hear. Singapore is the country that has created a miracle, frankly. It is one of the most advanced countries on earth. They have an amazing technology, an amazing economy, and they have done something really incredible. They managed to have a very close partnership with both the United States and China. And so I am always grateful when I see Minister Ang, the Defense Minister of Singapore, or any of his fellow Singaporean government officials, because boy, does Singapore give us good advice. And so we really appreciate it, Minister Ang. We're grateful to you for being here. I know it's a long way to come. But we want to hear really your perspective on what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. And no one better to interview him than Ravi Agrawal, who runs our famous magazine, Foreign Policy. Thank you.
Minister Ng Eng Hen, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the United States. Welcome to Aspen. You must be jet-lagged. So there's a lot that I want to cover with you, and I thought I'd begin with a topic that many of us in the West like to ask Singaporeans about, China. And listening to the previous discussion, you know, there's little question now that over the last decade or so, China has just become a lot more belligerent. You can speak to the Indians about that on their border, speak to the Filipinos, speak to the Australians. China is, of course, threatening Taiwan. It is providing components to Russia that are aiding it in its war in Ukraine. And the question that I want to ask you, and I have been trying to understand for some time, is why? You understand the Chinese well. Why do you think they have shifted in the last decade or so to become more assertive and belligerent?
Well, thank you, Ravi. First, thank you very much to the Aspen Security Forum for inviting me here. It's my first time to Aspen. I've been to the United States quite often, but I didn't have the opportunity to come to Aspen, and I sort of asked, why a security forum in Aspen? So my wife is here with me, and when we came from DC, and when I saw Aspen from the air, I had an epiphany. I know why you have a security forum in Aspen. So thank you for being. Yeah. I told my wife.
Shangri-La in Singapore is also lovely.
I told my wife, said, look, there's a Republican convention going on, you know, they're investigating the would-be assassination. There won't be many people in this forum. And they all came to listen to me. Well, thank you. I don't pretend to understand China or want to be an apologist for China, so let me frame our perspective. We have two theaters of conflict, right? One in Ukraine from February 24th, 2022, as Jonai said, the third year of conflict. Military objectives can't be achieved on either side. Zelensky doesn't want to deal with a diplomatic solution, which he says publicly, and he said in the Shangri-La dialogue. You have one which started October 7th, Hamas attack. The retaliation, the retribution by the IDF is painful for all of us. But the greater problem there is that it can expand beyond Gaza and Israel. And I would say that we can ill afford a third theater of conflict in Asia. First, I don't think the system can take it, but I think more importantly, I think the reasons for casus belli are simply not there, and not yet, or at least not yet. So I know you asked a lot of questions, but let me stop there because I'm sure having framed it the way Singapore sees it, you would have more specific questions.
Sure. Well, I mean, so once again, you're such an astute observer of China. Can you try and explain from speaking to them, from your interlocutors there, how are they seeing the world and why do you think they're acting as they are?
Well, if you sort of situate yourself in China, a lot of things that they're doing seem to make sense to them. I'm not saying they didn't make any mistakes. So to build, for example, features within the South China Sea, to move their forward defense line a couple of 100 kilometers forward makes perfect military strategic sense. The island chains concept was an American concept, and it was meant to contain China. And from their point of view, if I could do it, I would, and they did. US's attention was elsewhere after 9/11, and they have fortified some of the features. The tribunal ruling said that they couldn't claim anything beyond the features. Tribunal ruling talked about what effectivities these islands or land masses or low tide elevations had. From, I think, the South China Sea, the assertiveness of the South China Sea, excuse me, was probably a bad foreign policy. If you speak to them quietly and candidly, they say that they don't claim every inch of water. They've said so, but in private they say they don't. How to roll it back, I think, is something that they need to deal with. So that would be positioned in South China Sea. We can talk about Taiwan, and we can talk about trade. They articulated a number of aspects on U.S., on their position vis-a-vis U.S. I think some of it was born out of hubris. It helps for economies to go through cycles, and I think it will be a salutary effect for China to be going through a difficult period. I hope it tempers and it gives some sense of reality, but not all that they did over the last 30 years would be, from their position, against their interests. So you talk about India, I agree with you. People didn't realize that at one point of time you had 400,000 troops, 200,000 on each side, and it could have gone very wrong.
Yeah, indeed. So let me flip that question now. When you look at how America's approach towards China has changed dramatically in the last 7 or 8 years, does that worry you? Do you think it's justified?
It does, but let me try to reframe it. China today is a wonderful testament of great American foreign policy from the 1960s to 2000. In fact, the whole of Asia, you talk across administrations, starting from President Kennedy, that one form of colonial control should not be replaced by an iron tyranny. That was in 1961, where America spearheaded the fight against communism. Talk about Ronald Reagan for coming down the Berlin Wall, winning the Cold War, as it were. You talk about President Clinton sponsoring China's ascension into the WTO. And the reason he gave, and that he could convince both sides of the aisle, was that it was important for the security of Asia. Now, if you ask yourself from that perspective, American foreign policy from the 1960s to, I think, somewhere in 2010, consistent, building a global system that benefited small and large countries, and the results have been spectacular economically. China is now 17% of world trade, economy of 17 trillion. The US is still leading at 28 trillion. But 800 million people lifted out of poverty. Nowhere historically has any country ever done that. ASEAN, in 1960s, if you take all of Asia, they accounted for 4% of global trade. It's now 30%. All these have been American successes. Now, what's changed since then?
Well, I noted you kind of stopped at 2010 there. What about 2010 to 2024?
The moving spirit did a volte-face and decided that the institutions in which created for globalization didn't work in its process. And I think the former Director General of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, lamented this. I mean, the bill didn't pass in 2022, but this was America trying to get out of the WTO, right? That was one. 2, tariffs, pulling out of the TPP. So America would have been the moving spirit for a globalized world, for trade, finance, that would benefit small and large countries, is now changed. We don't know where it will go, and I don't think China is the only reason. And we'll have to ask ourselves, and that panel where proceeding was fascinating, we have to ask ourselves, in the future, where will US be, where will China be? Because the reality now for China, from the Asian perspective, China is now the largest trading partner for almost all countries in Asia. Now, Joe and I talks about soft power. Kissinger talks about legitimacy. And here's a question for you. Can US sustain its global presence and its military presence in Asia solely predicated on military power?
I'm guessing the answer is no. I mean, that was a rhetorical question.
In the 1960s, in case you haven't noticed, I'm sorry to have to say this, Americans weren't always popular in Asia. In the 1960s, as I said, there was a real anti-American backlash, even though they understood the fight against communism. Sukarno spoke against US, and the situation in Laos and Cambodia, the bombing didn't help. My founding prime minister was a man of great wisdom, and he stuck to the courage of his convictions. In 1966, he announced that American soldiers who were based in Vietnam could come to Singapore for an R&R. Now, in 1990, when America had been more popular because basically the foreign policy worked, the ASEAN economies that had decolonized, had rising tide lifted all boats, and the ASEAN economies grew. But when American forces had to pull out of Clark and Subic, we offered Singapore not as a base because it was just too small, but even today, American ships and planes are the largest user. They rotate through Changi and naval bases. So from Singapore's perspective, we've held that the US presence in Asia is a force for stability. We say it's indispensable, but that was of a US that was leading the global charge. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when you addressed the US Congress in 1985, he said this. He said, America as a hyperpower, a superpower, will have to decide on the rules and enforce it, which America did marvelously, I would say, for 20 years hence. Today, I would argue that it's a different America, and one that has to be careful to maintain its moral legitimacy even in Asia.
Are you saying America's lost its moral legitimacy in Asia?
It has to maintain its moral legitimacy.
Let me find another way of asking you this question. So I'll talk about a few other arenas. So
Let me answer that in the Chinese.
Please.
Okay.
Yes.
The Chinese say to us, you know, you ASEAN countries or Asian countries, you're very difficult. You choose China when it comes to trade, and you choose America when it comes to military power. So we look at them and say, why not?
Fair. And, you know, in a sense, there are many countries now in the global south that, you know, sense a shifting world order, that sense not absolute American decline, but relative, in relative terms, relative American decline, and a relative rise for China. And that changes things. And I'm curious, as, you know, we're here at Aspen Security Conference, but you host Shangri-La, and you get to see all these defense ministers from around the world who come there. Just last month, your counterparts from America and China were there. I'm curious, if there were to be a skirmish in the Indo-Pacific, what would that look like? What happens?
That would be cataclysmic, whatever the outcome. It would test Pax Americana, and discovery, I think, is what we want to avoid. And let me clarify that. In the Third Taiwan Straits in 1995, 1996, you remember President Clinton mobilized 2 aircraft carriers. Chinese had missiles pointing towards Taiwan, and thankfully, both stood down, or at least both claimed that they stopped their exercises. If you had another situation today, I'm not sure what the outcome is, and I'm not sure that we want to discover it. Because it won't be a simple or short outcome. I've said that Taiwan is not Ukraine, and China is not Russia. Taiwan is an island. To resupply Taiwan, you would need Japan and Korea and draw them in. And China is not Russia. China has got military capabilities, 17% of trade, but the effect on us will be devastating. So this is a very complex situation. We talked about, you know, what Americans' policy is when it comes to commerce and trade. The truth is, we really are not quite sure how that goes, but from a security perspective, I think all of us should be very, very careful to avoid any physical conflict for at least this decade, if not for the longer, because discovery will be very painful and will be probably life-changing. If America is able to maintain its military supremacy in Asia, that won't stop China. China will hunker down. Global trade will end with China. China will spend more on military spending. And the contest will go on for another couple of decades, maybe even more than one generation. If America, we discover, can't maintain its military supremacy, I think that's the beginning of the end of Pax Americana.
I'm only going to ask you one question about Donald Trump.
I won't answer it.
I'll put it to you hypothetically.
He's a nice man. Yes.
Hypothetically.
I hope his ear recovers.
Yeah, we all do. In all seriousness, we all do. But hypothetically, we've all heard now several potential ranges of what a Trump 2.0 China policy could look like, ranging from, we will dismiss managed competition, we're in it to win it. You heard about the trade tariffs. A lot of that would rock the boat significantly. Is anything going on behind the scenes to try and...
Well, it is what it is, but I would remind you that, we've worked with the Trump administration for meeting Singapore, and he was very happy with Singapore because we have a trade surplus with you. And security-wise, it was in 2015 that my Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, renewed the MOU, the military MOU, to continue American ships and planes going through Singapore. So we've worked with the Trump administration. I'm not so much concerned because it makes a big difference, but on trade, and you had experts talking about it. Now, when it comes to lists, I think it's possible to try to have small yard high fences, and you talk about strategic, non-strategic. But when you break it down, you're not quite sure because the fundamental aspect, I think it was touched upon. If you talk about trade, it's not quite trade, it's information. And we talked about how electric cars can, and if you ask, well, if I'm trying to protect information, and that becomes a security risk, then the yard goes bigger. If you talk about security, food security, interdependency, the yard goes bigger. If you talk about capital, which is the most fungible of all, it's already begun. You invest in a Chinese company that has a holding which has security aspects, and therefore you cannot do business with America or America's companies. Then it becomes very difficult, and probably, I think it's not undoable, but I would humbly submit that we are not sure. It's very hard to decipher what the real outcome of this new industrial policy is.
Fair. I want to ask you about the war in Gaza. In Southeast Asia, you're surrounded by a lot of countries that have significant Muslim populations, Indonesia, Malaysia, your own country as well. What is the mood like, and how are you gauging the West's role in the Middle East?
Oh, anger. Singapore has a Muslim population of 15%, and we had just announced 2 people that were picked up because they were radicalized, and this was a 14-year-old boy who pledged that he would commit jihad. So obviously there are effects, and it's been difficult for countries that whether they have Muslim populations or not. I think the problem is that you've radicalized another generation of would-be terrorists in Gaza and elsewhere. So we hope that the violence in Gaza would end soon, and all we have done is to try to help and give humanitarian aid. We gave airdrops to Gaza by way of Jordan. But really, this, I think, has a longer tail, and it's unfortunate that it happened. And but the larger problem, of course, is Iran, and the Israelis know it, and the progressive Arab states know it. How much this has upended the Abraham Accord, I think it has. I think some of the states want to resume relations with Israel, but domestically in their politics, this has made it very, very difficult for them to sell their message.
Do you think America, given what you're saying, I mean, the first word you said was anger, is America losing soft power?
Not so much soft power, but I think across many countries we've lost the young on this. The young are, even in Singapore, particularly incensed about the violence and the fact that nothing is done to stop it. So you would lose political support. I don't think, not so much in soft power, some of it, but there are other issues that I talked about in terms of what does America want to do about trade. What Asians, people, I suppose, can't wrap their minds around is, how can the US say that the trade practice is unfair when it's, to them, they're the richest country in the world, where America's, 28 trillion economy, per capita GDP, there may be inequality in America, but when they see America, they see a rich country. So when you talk about unfair trade practices, and they're not talking about US and China, they're talking about US and them, they find that difficult to understand. So if there was a plea, whichever person occupies the White House, is that we believe that America's military presence should continue, and we will facilitate that. We believe that America should continue to be a global leader in setting the rules of trade. We believe that America should continue to trade. And I am fully in agreement with the previous panel to talk about engagement. The last time the defense ministers visited each other from US and China was in 2018. This was Jim Mattis and Wei Fenghe. I think that has to resume very quickly. I think the lines of communications should be set up between military to military. I agree completely with Anya that it's very dangerous not to have comms. It's a good thing that Dong Chin, who's the new defense minister, agreed that he wanted more communications with Secretary Austin. So I hope whoever occupies the White House and the new defense minister, that they would follow up on that.
Your country's been investing a lot more in defense itself. I think if you look at the last 4 years, the percentage increase has been, ranging between 5 and 12% increases year on year, which is quite a lot. You're a small country, but a mighty country. Talk to us a little bit about how you're thinking about defense regionally, and is this coming from a place of fear about potential adversaries?
Well, it comes from paranoia. Paranoid survives. So, but
paranoid about what?
If you know our history, we separated from Malaysia, and it was a difficult time for Southeast Asia. There was a threat of communism. Actually, our defense spending has come down. We used to spend as much as 5% of our GDP on defense. We're now spending about 3.1, 3.2, and I think it'll stabilize to that. But you're right, in nominal terms, it's gone up.
Absolute terms.
Yeah. And we believe that defense is the best deterrence. We have no plans or no capability of projecting ourselves, and we don't want to project ourselves anywhere. But Mr. Lee had this term, poison shrimp, for defense forces. We think we're bigger than a shrimp now, but we're still poison. So we'll keep it as that, and we think that we'll continue to spend. By the way, we have conscription. So every 18-year-old spends 2 years full-time in the military, and then we call them back for a few weeks, 10 years after that. So it's a people's army, but we're fairly well equipped. So we think we project the good image of deterrence, and if the government continues to fund it, my department will continue to raise that armed forces that we think we need.
I want to talk about your country's fairly studied neutrality when it comes to world events, and that's of immense value, clearly. I mean, just listening to you talk, your perspective is so useful. But I'm curious how you think about neutrality in a world that is in flux, in a world that is at war.
I'm not sure that we believe in neutrality. I mean, again, I quote a lot of Mr. Lee because he's a profound influence, but he and the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and all of us are quite taken with, you know, the Melia dialogue. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's our ethos. And if you're weak, then what do? Well, we believe not so much in neutrality, but in information, in observing, in trying to be ultimate realists and saying what works, what doesn't. And we don't believe that we can balance superpowers, but we would speak to them and we would try to find some space where all sides need us. Whether we can succeed, I mean, history will tell, but I think the US-China conundrum will decide the fates of all our nations for this decade and next. And what America has to decide, and I understand all the policies of small yard, high fences, security alliances, but ultimately, what is the foreign policy towards China? I'm not sure that I have a clear idea. Is China me an enemy? Is China me an enemy for how long? Can China be a friend? And how would you go about it? Those are difficult questions.
Have you asked those questions of
Constantly, every day we're looking at you and saying, what's up? What gives?
Very quickly, just a last thought. I talked about a world in flux. This is also a world in which, you know, there are all these grand ideas and terms being thrown around. A new Cold War, a new battle between democracies and autocracies. And again, I mean, your point of speaking to all sides is well taken. But how do you fit in values when you see countries profess competing agendas and values, essentially?
If this is not a contest of ideas, or ideology at least, well, not overtly like capitalism and communism. It is a contest, but if you look at US, no one should bet against the US. We talked about advanced technology. I'm trying to answer your question, but bear with me. Man for man, and I was Minister of Education, so I visited the universities in China, whether it was Zhejiang or Shanghai Jiaotong or Fudan University. Man for man, the Chinese students can match any American student. You know it. You have them. But systems-wise, the American system is still ahead. And that's the reason why you have more Chinese or Japanese who win Nobel Prizes when they come out of their countries to come to here. And that's what you still have, and that's what you continue to have. What value system produces that? Well, that's psychoanalyzing US, which is too difficult. But whatever you have it, and you should keep at it. But is China, led by the CCP, the Communist Party of China, one that has wrong values? Kissinger called China a historical singularity, right? It's a palimpsest. In other words, if you strip away different forms of government, there's still China and goes way down deep. The values deep. And I think that if you want to make China an enemy, it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I feel very strongly that engagement is important, that as you did previously, that China is worth becoming a friend. And we know Graham Allison's book that, you know, says that the outcome for it may be war, but there are good reasons to believe that if US can have a positive trajectory with China, that I think it'll make for certain greater stability, certain greater growth, and I believe it is within the powers of American leadership, if not now, maybe later, but I well believe that when you need something innovative, when you need to fix a difficult problem, that Americans have always shown us that you can do it. So we look to you for leadership.
This is a really useful perspective. Minister Ng, thank you very much. Round of applause.
Thank you, Minister Ng. Thank you, Ravi. And thank you to all of you for being here with us. I just want to echo what Joe said, who was our chairman, and we're really grateful to him. And he started us off by talking about us meeting here for our 15th anniversary in extremely turbulent times. I was talking to Marie-Louise Kelly, who's one of our moderators, one of our great journalists before, and she said, "Oh boy, what chaos." And it's a really important opportunity to remind all of us why we come here, why, as Dr. Ng said, we fly all the way to Aspen with the backdrop of these really magnificent mountains, because it gets us out of the daily rat race. It gets us out of shouting at each other about our grievances and about our differences. It gets us out of our task lists, our egos. And we're going to do something different here over the next couple of days. And we really all believe in this mission, and that is to remind ourselves collectively why we chose these noble professions in the first place. We became diplomats, government servants, military officials, innovators, business leaders, great journalists, and we're all in this together. And so we're going to have constructive, calm, quiet dialogue, and we're going to try to collectively find a better and more positive way forward. So it leaves me just to do two very important short tasks. One is the most important of all, and that is to thank the incredible Aspen Strategy Group team that puts all of this together. If you can all stand, Neve, Deb, Leah, Emily, Alana, Anna, Matilda, Karina, and Chris. It is a small but mighty team, and we're grateful to you. Thanks to all of you for being here. Now, everyone who is an Aspen Security Forum pass holder, please join us over in Door Hosier for our opening reception. We're going to give you a drink. We're going to talk about interesting topics, and we meet bright and early again tomorrow morning in Door Hosier at 9 a.m. to get started. Thank you all.